The morning they came to count her pigs, Nora Voss was already in the pasture, boots sunk to the ankle in dark mud, watching a sow the size of a wardrobe door push her broad gray snout into the earth at the base of the eastern hill. The sow had been working that same spot for 3 days running, circling back to it the way a dog circles before sleep, patient and certain, in the way only large, anciently intelligent animals ever manage to be. Nora stood still and watched. She had learned, in the 8 months since she bought this scorned piece of ground and its equally scorned inhabitants, that the pigs knew things she did not. Not in a mystical sense, not in any way she could have explained to the county assessor, who was, at that moment, walking up the lane behind her in good leather shoes, but in the plain and practical sense that they had 4 legs and a nose pressed to the ground, and she did not. So she watched. And under the sow's working snout the clay cracked, and then it wept, and then a thin thread of water came up from below the tilting world like a secret the hill had been keeping since before anyone alive could remember. Nora did not shout. She pressed her cracked lips together, and she breathed, and she felt something she could not name travel the length of her spine. 2 years earlier. That is where the true story begins. The kill pen outside Caldwell sat at the end of a road that smelled like iron in summer and like iron in winter, and the difference was only in how cold the iron was. Nora Voss drove out to it in April of 1887 in a borrowed wagon that belonged to her nearest neighbor, a Bohemian man of 70 named Pavel Horak, who had lent her the wagon and 2 hours of his time and nothing else, because he was a practical man and believed, as most practical people in that county believed, that what she was about to do was the errand of a person who had not slept properly in months. She had not slept properly in months. She had arrived the previous autumn with her father's deed to 160 acres of the kind of land that makes a surveyor look at a map twice and then look at the actual ground, and then look back at the map as if one of them is lying. The eastern third was a clay pan so hard it had turned 3 plows in living memory. The western edge ran to a dry creek bed that had not held water since a man named Euclid Marsh had rerouted it in 1879 to serve his own fields, and who had then moved to Kansas City and was therefore not available to be reasoned with. The middle 100 acres was grass, thin, sparse, the color of an old broom, and the town of Harlan, 4 miles south, had opinions about all of it. The opinions were not kind. She is too young, they said. She is a woman alone, they said. She will be back in the town renting a room before the first frost bites, they said. And they said it in the tone people use when they are rehearsing for the satisfaction of being right. Nora was 24 years old, and she had $17 and the deed and a set of tools her father had used, and she intended to prove them wrong in the way she had always proved people wrong, which was silently and with her hands, and by waiting longer than the other person was willing to wait. The deed had come to her by her father's death the previous August, and the land had come to him by a bet the previous decade from a man who had been very certain it was worth nothing and had lost the bet and the land together, and had rightly concluded that both transactions had worked out in his favor. Nora had stood on the clay pan in her first week and done the arithmetic. To break that ground for any conventional crop would cost her more than she had. To run cattle on it, she would need water and grass she did not have. She could plant sod corn in the thin middle and hope, and the word hope was doing very heavy lifting in that sentence, or she could think about the land differently. She thought about it differently. She thought about it for 2 weeks, walking the property in the early morning dark with a lantern, reading the ground the way her father had taught her, which was to say, not with your eyes, but with the bottoms of your boots and the corners of your attention. She noticed the clay pan was not flat. It tilted very slightly eastward. She noticed that after the one rain that fell in October, the low margin of the pan had held the water longer than it should have. She noticed, on the 3rd week, a line of different colored grass at the base of the eastern hill, darker and thicker than the rest, a seam of green in a gray field, which meant water was near it even if it was not visible. She was not a geologist, but she was observant, and she thought something that roots, and roots deep, and does not mind clay, and does not mind thin ground, and has a nose better than mine for what the ground is keeping. She thought about pigs. The pigs at the kill pen were not, by any objective measure, a promising sight. 60 sows, most of them middle-aged, all of them thin in the specific defeated way that comes not from one bad week but from many bad months in succession, ribs countable from 10 feet, hips like tent pegs under rough gray hide, ears down, eyes flat. The drover running the pen was a florid, wide man named Atchison, who wore a vest regardless of temperature and spoke to Nora the way some men speak to children and other men speak to furniture. He told her they were culls, done out, not a breeding sow worth $1 among them, good only for what they were already ticketed for. And if she was looking to buy animals, she ought to head into town where there were proper stock sales and proper animals being sold by proper people. He said proper 3 times in that sentence, and each time he said it, he looked at her coat, which was her father's coat, and was too large in the shoulders. Nora looked at the sows. She looked at their legs, which were sound. She looked at their snouts, which were intact. She looked at the architecture of their heads, which told her they had Berkshire and possibly Chester White in their recent history, which meant they were the kind of animals that had been bred for exactly the quality she needed, which was the capacity to find food in the ground when the ground above offered nothing. She made Atchison a fair offer. He laughed. She made him the same offer again without changing her expression, and he stopped laughing and sold them to her, because 60 bony sows at her price was more money than 60 dead sows at no price. And arithmetic is not sentimental, even when men are. Pavel Horak drove the wagon back, and they walked the sows alongside it, a slow gray tide of large bony animals moving down the road in the early afternoon, and the two of them were quiet. Pavel had a way of being quiet that was not disapproving. He was quiet the way old ground is quiet, because it has already settled into what it is. At the gate to the property, he stopped the wagon and looked at the clay pan and looked at the sows, and he said something that Nora would return to many times in the months that followed. He said, in his accented, careful way, "The land does not care who is right, it cares who stays." Then he drove his wagon home. Nora stayed. The first 3 months were the kind of months that make a person understand why so many people give up, not because any single day was catastrophic, but because the accumulation of difficulty has a weight that is different from any individual problem. It settles into your shoulders, and it does not leave, and you carry it through every hour, including the ones when you are sleeping, so that you wake tired and go to bed tired, and the only question is whether the work between those 2 moments is enough. Nora had built a rough shelter for the sows, 3-sided, open to the south. In the first week, using timber she had pulled from a collapsed outbuilding on the property's north edge, and she had reinforced the fence line with wire she bought on credit from the Harlan Mercantile, whose owner, a man named Cressfield, had watched her count out what she owed with the focused attention of a man who expected to be seeing that same person seek further credit in the near future. She put the sows on the clay pan, and she watched. This is what people in town did not understand, and what Pavel understood, and what the sows understood without being told. A pig on the right ground does not need a great deal of managing. It needs containment, water, a mineral supplement she mixed herself from salt and wood ash, and a small amount of purchased limestone. And it needs to be allowed to do the thing it has been doing since before the notion of a farm existed, which is to push its nose into the ground and find what the ground is keeping. Day after day after day, the sows worked the clay pan. They drove their snouts into the hard pan and levered it up with a force that would have impressed a man with a mattock. They moved across the tilted pan in slow, overlapping patterns, rooting up the compacted clay, turning it to something that admitted air and, when the May rains came, water. Nora walked behind them in the evenings with a lantern, looking at what they had worked, pressing her boot into broken clay that had been as solid as brick 6 weeks before. The arithmetic was changing. She kept a ledger in a tobacco tin under her sleeping board, feed costs, mineral costs, the credit she owed Cressfield, the slowly reducing number of what she called absolute bottom days, the number of days she could sustain the operation before the money ran out entirely. In May, that number was 41. She worked the number every evening, and she did not despair. She adjusted, the way water adjusts to the shape of whatever is in front of it. In June, things began to happen that she did not tell anyone about. The first was the acorns. She had not noticed in her autumn survey of the property that the scrub oak at the base of the western hill dropped, in a good year, a quantity of mass that was, for pigs, the equivalent of a pantry full of good food. She noticed it in June because she found 2 of the sows who had gotten through a gap in the fence and were standing in the oak shadow with the specific satisfaction of animals who have discovered something they did not expect. She fixed the fence and she thought about it. A pig finished on mast has a flavor that no grain-finished animal can match. She knew this because her father's family had run razorback hogs on woodland in Tennessee before the war, and she had grown up hearing it described. And she knew, in the abstract way she knew many things about value, that there were people in cities who would pay a great deal for the flavor of a thing they could not otherwise obtain. She wrote a letter to a hotel in Kansas City, and she waited. She kept this to herself the way she kept most things to herself, like a coal-banked low under ash, because the town's opinion of what she was doing was not helpful to her, and had never been helpful to her, and she had learned at some early point in her life that people who have decided something is worthless become confused and then angry when the evidence begins to contradict them, and their confusion and anger are not productive additions to anyone's morning. The second thing that happened in June was that Marta Horrock's youngest granddaughter, a girl of 11 named Irina, began appearing at the fence line every afternoon after her schoolwork was done, regarding the sows with an expression of alert scientific curiosity that Nora recognized because it was the expression she herself made in mirrors when she was trying to work something out. Nora did not send her away. She handed her the mineral bucket and showed her the mixing ratio, and Irina memorized it in one hearing and recited it back perfectly, and then named 14 of the sows after saints and the remaining 46 after flowers, and announced that the largest sow, the one with the scarred left ear, was named Peony and was the finest animal on the property, a judgment Nora privately agreed with. By July, the rooted clay pan had begun, in its eastern third, to show what Nora had hoped and feared to see. Hoped because it meant she was right. Feared because being right about a hard thing does not make the hard thing easier, only more clearly necessary. The turned clay, where it caught the rain, was holding moisture. The mineral-laced supplement, worked into the broken ground on the sow's hooves and snouts, had altered the surface chemistry enough that a thin cover of volunteer grass was beginning to emerge in the wettest part of the low margin, the dark grass seam she had noted in October. She told Pavel. He came and looked and said nothing for a long time, and then said, yes. That was all. It was enough. In August, a buyer arrived. August arrived like the open door of a furnace and stayed for 5 weeks. The grass on the thin middle hundred went from broom-colored to the color of old bone. The creek beds in Harlan County lay baking and pale, and the corn in the field south of town was making a sound in the dry wind that farmers knew and did not like to hear, which was the papery whisper of stalks that are giving up. The town was not in a good mood. It is a specific kind of anxiety that drought brings, not the clean, sharp fear of an immediate disaster, but the slow, grinding dread of watching the arithmetic of the season turn against you day by day, counting down toward a number you do not want to reach. Nora's pigs were on the rooted clay pan, where the broken ground held what little rain had fallen, And the deep-nosed sows were still finding things: grubs, roots, underground water, the particular dark mineral taste that draws a pig the way a story draws a person. Peony had led 3 others to the base of the eastern hill and was working it with sustained concentration. Nora watched. August burnt on. The letter from the Kansas City hotel came back on a Thursday. Yes, they were interested. How many animals could she provide? What was her price per dressed weight? She wrote back carefully. She had one chance at this price, and she knew it, and she was not greedy. She was fair, because fair prices keep buyers, and gouging prices keep only the one transaction. She quoted what was honest, with enough margin to stay solvent, and she waited. The reply took 11 days, and in those 11 days she slept poorly and rose before light, and walked the fence in the dark, and did not tell anyone, not even Pavel, because even hope has a weight when it is known. It was also in those 11 days that Harlan's most prosperous cattle agent, a man named Delbert Crane, began to pay attention. Crane was the kind of man who smelled money the way Peony smelled groundwater. At a distance, through solid obstacles. With accuracy he never acknowledged as such, but always presented as good business sense. He had watched Nora arrive the previous autumn with the detached amusement of a man who expects a small entertainment at someone else's expense, and he had watched her subsequent months with the slow increasing unease of a man whose entertainment is not developing on schedule. He rode out on a Wednesday and tied his horse at her gate and called across the fence in the warm, false voice of a man extending a great personal favor. He told her he had been thinking about her situation, her being alone out here, a young woman with 60 animals and no help and no market, and the year going the way it was going, and he was prepared out of neighborliness, purely out of neighborliness, to take the whole lot off her hands at a price that was, he assured her, more than fair given the circumstances. He did not say what price, not yet. That would come after she had thought about it, after the weight of the circumstances had settled on her more thoroughly. He said she ought to think on it. She looked at him across the fence line, her hands dusty, and her boots mud-heavy, and she said she had a buyer in Kansas City she was in communication with. Crane smiled the smile of a man who has heard this before. Kansas City is a long way, he said, and 60 head is a lot to move alone. She looked at him for a moment without expression and said she appreciated his visit, and turned back to the sows. He rode away. He came back twice more in the next week, each time a little less warm, a little more businesslike, making reference to the drought and to market prices and to the difficulty of moving animals over long distances without experience. And each time she met him with the same calm, flat courtesy, and said nothing about the letter, and nothing about the price she had been quoted, because Delbert Crane's knowledge of those things was not in her interest, and she knew, without quite articulating it to herself, that a man who smells money has more patience than a man who merely wants it. The reply from Kansas City came on the 42nd day since she had first written, and it said yes to her price, and yes to 60 head, and yes to a representative coming to inspect. She read it at the table in the small dark morning before the light came up, and she sat with it for a while, and then she stood up and went to the sows. Irina arrived that afternoon and found Nora in the pen with Peony's head pressed against her hip. The sow was leaning on her the way a very large, very peaceful thing leans on a person it trusts. And Irina looked at Nora's face and said, "Something happened." Nora said, "Maybe." Irina said, "Good something or bad something?" Nora said, "I believe good." And Irina gave a single decisive nod and went to get the mineral bucket, as if the matter were settled and it was time to get back to work. The inspector from Kansas City arrived on a September morning when the air had just barely remembered it was capable of being something other than hot, and his name was Fenwick, and he wore a city suit and carried a leather case, and stepped out of the hired buggy with the specific careful step of a man who had not grown up near livestock and was making adjustments in real time. He stood at the fence and looked at 60 large-framed, deep-sided sows who looked back at him with the calm authority of animals who are aware that they are in better condition than they look. And then he looked at the rooted ground, at the broken clay now threaded with volunteer grass in its low eastern margins, and he opened his leather case and took out a notebook and wrote something in it. He asked her about the finishing, the oak mast, the duration, the mineral regimen. And she told him plainly, and he wrote as she talked. He asked if he could look at the dressed weight of one animal, and she said she had kept records, and she showed him the ledger. He studied it for longer than she expected. Then he looked at the property again, at the clay pan, at the eastern hill, at the seam of darker grass. He said, in the tone of a man who is committing to something, "You have something unusual here." She said yes. He said, "The hotel will want a standing arrangement, not just this season." She looked at him evenly. She said, "I am open to that." He named a price per dressed pound for a standing contract, and it was higher than her letter had quoted, and she did not let her face change. And she said that sounded reasonable, and he nodded and wrote it down. And neither of them said anything more than necessary, because some agreements do not improve with more words. He tasted nothing that afternoon because the finishing would not be complete until October, but he shook her hand at the gate, and he drove back down the road to Harlan, and at some point in that 4-mile drive he must have said something to the driver, because by the following morning the town of Harlan knew that a man from Kansas City had come to look at Nora Voss's pigs and had shaken her hand at the gate and driven away with his notebook and his leather case, and an expression that could only be described as satisfied. The town had opinions. The town always had opinions. But the quality of the opinions was changing, which is not the same as the town admitting it had been wrong, because towns rarely admit that. They simply shift from one certainty to another, from "she will fail before frost" to, well, of course she knew what she was doing. Anyone could see it, in a tone that requires a certain charity from the person being discussed. Nora was charitable. She did not crow. She did not stand in the mercantile and remind Cressfield of what he had expected, or stand in the street and let the summer's mockery play back to her in her head like a thing she was owed. She simply paid off her credit at the mercantile in full, in cash, in a single transaction that Cressfield received with an expression she was kind enough to call surprise. She ordered materials for a proper barn. She sat with Pavel on his porch in the cool of the September evening, and he brought out the bottle he kept for occasions and poured 2 small measures of something dark and strong that tasted like a forest in another country. And he said, "The land does not care who is right. It cares who stays." And she said, "I know, Pavel, you told me." And he said, "I know, I told you. I am telling you again because now you have earned the second telling." She laughed, a real laugh, the kind that surprises you. And it was the first time she had laughed like that since her father's death, and it felt like a door opening in a room that had been shut too long. 3 weeks later, the crisis arrived. This is the way of things. You do not get the good without the bad arriving on its heels, because the world is not arranged for comfort, but for instruction. The crisis came in 2 parts, as the worst ones do. The first part was Delbert Crane, who had done what the town had not yet done, which was actually look at her ledger. He had not seen it personally, but he had a cousin who worked in the county assessor's office. And the cousin had seen the assessment, and the assessment had noted, as assessments must, the improving condition of the property and the standing contract with a Kansas City hotel that had by October moved from a rumor to a documented fact. Crane filed a complaint with the county clerk suggesting that Nora's original deed, which had come to her father by a bet and to her by inheritance, contained a conditional clause regarding productive use of the eastern clay pan. A clause that, he argued, she had failed to satisfy within the specified time frame, and that therefore the deed reverted to county management, which in practice meant it became available for purchase by interested parties, of which Delbert Crane happened, coincidentally, to be one. The complaint was not immediately actionable. These things take time. But the time it took was designed to be long enough to cause difficulty and short enough to prevent proper preparation. And the county clerk's office set a hearing for the 3rd week of October, which was also the week Nora had arranged to begin moving animals to the finisher. The second part of the crisis was the water. The autumn rains that should have come in late September had not come. The dry creek beds stayed dry, and the one shallow well on the western edge of the property, which had been marginal in a good season, had dropped to a depth that made it unreliable for 60 large animals. The arithmetic on water was not good. She ran the numbers in the evening, and the numbers said 3 weeks, maybe 4 if she was careful, and then she would need to haul, and hauling was a daily cost she had not budgeted for. She did the arithmetic again. It did not improve. She sat in the dark, and she breathed, and she thought. And then she went out to the eastern pasture, and stood and looked at the base of the hill in the dark, and thought about Peony working that spot for 3 days, and thought about the darker grass seam, and thought about what she knew about clay, and about what water does when it wants to move. She dug on a Saturday and Sunday with Pavel. She had told him, and he had come, without being asked to, on Saturday morning with a spade and an expression of quiet resolve. And Irina came on Sunday and moved the excavated clay in a bucket, back and forth, small and steady, and without complaint. And by Sunday evening they had gone down 4 feet on the east side of the sow's working spot, and the clay had gone from dry to damp to a dark and oozing moisture, and then, at 4 feet and 8 inches, a thin thread came up through the floor of the hole, and Pavel said something in Bohemian, and Nora said, "What did you say?" And he said, "I said the hill was not keeping it. It was only waiting for someone patient enough to ask." She stood there in the dark, with muddy arms to the elbow, and looked at the thread of water widening slowly into a pool at the bottom of the excavation, and she did the arithmetic again, and this time the arithmetic was different. Over the following 4 days, she and Pavel dug the spring pocket out properly, a stone-lined basin 5 feet across, with a channel cut to a lower trough where the animals could drink. And the water came up steady and cold and tasted, she said later, like something that had been a long time underground and had made its peace with the waiting. The spring solved the water crisis. It did not solve Delbert Crane. The hearing was on a Tuesday. Nora arrived with the deed and with the ledger, and with one additional document. She had spent an evening composing with the help of Pavel's older dictionary and her own careful handwriting, a point-by-point reading of the clause in question, which she had read 8 times and which did not, in its actual language, say what Crane's complaint said it said. The clause required productive agricultural use, which was a phrase with legal breadth that, in 1887, had never been applied in any county decision to exclude hog farming and had, in 3 documented cases she had found in the county clerk's own records, been satisfied by exactly the kind of ground improvement she had accomplished. She had written those 3 cases down by number and page. She had also, without entirely planning it, brought Fenwick's letter of contract, because it seemed the kind of document that speaks for itself. The county clerk, a careful man named Aldous Beaumont, read what she put in front of him with the focused concentration of a man who is deciding whether he is about to make an error. And then he read the complaint again, and then he asked Crane one question, which was, "How did you obtain the figure for the per-pound contract price that you have quoted in this complaint?" Crane's answer, which was not a good one, was that it was a matter of common knowledge. Beaumont looked at him for a moment, and then looked back at the documents and said, in the tone of a man who was closing a subject, that the deed was sound, the clause was satisfied, and the complaint was without merit. He set the papers down. Crane stood in the room for a moment with the expression of a man who has been handed a conclusion he had not purchased, and then he walked out, and the room was quiet, and Nora walked to the table and picked up her documents one at a time, and put them in order, and folded them, and put them inside her father's coat. Being right, she had once heard Pavel say, is its own kind of reply. It was. The drive to the Kansas City finisher happened over 4 days in the last week of October, cool and gold. The kind of prairie autumn that makes you understand why people stay in flat country that has offered them nothing. Because when the country is kind, it is very kind, and the light across flat ground has a quality that is different from mountain light or forest light. It is wide, and it includes everything in it, and walking through it with 60 large, well-fed sows who have spent 8 months discovering everything the ground was keeping is, if not happiness exactly, something close enough to happiness that the distinction hardly matters. She sold 40 of the 60. She kept 20, the best 20, with Peony at their head. The return was enough to retire the remaining debt, to pay for the barn materials, to put back a reserve, and to leave a margin she had not allowed herself to imagine in those first tight spring months when 41 days had been her horizon. She brought a portion of the return to the mercantile and paid Cressfield the interest he had never asked for on her credit account, which surprised him enough that he did not speak for a moment, and then said she was not required to, and she said she knew that, and left. Winter came down on the county with a force that reminded everyone who had been worrying about drought that the plains have more than one kind of difficulty in their repertoire. The corn harvest south of town had been poor, as the August whisper of the stalks had promised. Several farms had not come through the season with their ledgers intact, and there was a specific kind of hungry that settled over the county in December that Nora understood because she had been close enough to it herself to recognize its particular quality. She had feed corn she had grown on the turned clay pan, not a large crop, not a beautiful crop, but a sound one grown on ground that was darker and richer than it had been a year ago because 60 large-nosed animals had worked it for 8 months and left it better than they found it. She sold the corn at fair prices to the farms that needed it most, which was not the best possible price, but was the price that let her neighbors stay. And staying, as she had been told and as she had proved, is what the land cares about. She gave some of it outright to the family on the creek road, whose youngest 3 children had the pinched look of a cold and insufficient autumn. And she told them it was surplus, and that they were doing her a favor, taking it off her hands, and both of those things were lies. But they were the kind of lies that leave everyone's dignity intact, which is the only kind worth telling. Pavel's wife sent back a jar of plum preserves and a note that said, in Pavel's handwriting, "She says thank you, and she says you have your father's sense." Nora set the note in the tobacco tin with the ledger and left it there. In the spring, 2 neighbors came to ask her about pigs, not to mock her. That particular entertainment had quietly retired itself over the winter without any formal ceremony, but to ask in the practical and direct way of people who have watched something work when they expected it to fail, whether she thought there was something to it, and whether she could point them toward what she had learned. She told them what she knew. She told them about the mineral supplement and the rooting pattern and the value of watching where the animals went back to again and again, because animals are not sentimental and they go back to things for reasons. She told them about the spring and about the grass seam, and about the difference between ground that has been worked and ground that has not. She did not tell them everything because she was not a fool, but she told them enough because she was not a miser, and there is a long middle ground between those 2 things where a person can live well. The county assessor came in April. His name was not important, and his shoes were good leather, and he sank into the mud at the pasture gate to a depth that ruined them, which seemed to Nora neither more nor less than appropriate. He looked at the clay pan, which was dark and turned and threaded with grass, at the stone-lined spring pocket, feeding the drinking trough at 20 large, deep-sided sows moving through their morning work, at the new barn standing solid on its stone footings. He wrote in his ledger, The numbers he wrote were larger than the numbers he had written the previous year. She watched him write them without expression. It is not, she thought, that the land became worth more. It is that it was always worth this. People simply could not see it until now. The morning they came to count her pigs, the assessor with his ledger, Cressfield from the mercantile, who had come in the vague way people attach themselves to things that are now worth attaching to, and two of the neighboring farmers who had come for honest reasons, Nora was in the pasture, watching Peony work the base of the eastern hill. The sow had her scarred ear tilted toward the ground, and her great gray snout pressed into the dark clay, and she was reading the ground in her old and patient language, and Nora stood behind her in the early light, and watched the thread of water come up through the place where the earth had given way, steady and cold and clear, the spring they had opened together, the hill's long secret made plain. Irina had arrived with Pavel by the time the water was visible, appearing at the fence with the mineral bucket still in her hands and climbing through the wire with the athletic certainty of a child who does not believe fences are meant for her. And she stood beside Nora, and they looked at the water together, and Irina said, "Peony found it first." Nora said, "She did." Irina said, "She always knows." "She does," Nora said. "She always did." The land had not changed. It had been the same ground through the dry year and the mocking year and the long first winter, the same clay with the same tilt and the same thread of water making its way up through the same hill in the same patient dark. "The ground does not care who is right," Pavel had said. "It cares who stays." She had stayed. She had brought 60 bony, discarded animals onto land no one wanted, and she had watched and listened and broken the clay open and found what was underneath, which was not nothing and had never been nothing. It was water and grass and dark-turned earth and the quiet, daily, irreversible fact of worth. The sows moved in the morning light, large and gray and unhurried, Peony at their center, all of them at their ancient work. The spring ran clear in its stone-lined pocket. The assessor wrote numbers in his ledger, and Nora stood at the center of the thing she had made, not a comfortable thing, not an easy thing, but a real and lasting thing. And she let herself, for one full minute in the gold and muddy morning, simply know that she had been right.